Okay, so as you guys take a look at this cheat sheet here, the first one, we've got rule number 1. And this is one that we've already talked about a little bit, but anytime you see two triangles sharing a side in your picture, also if they're sharing an angle, you are going to go and talk about the reflexive properties somewhere in your proof. Remember, we've talked about with proofs, the order does not matter. So it does need to be on some line, but you will need to write somewhere in your proof that this middle line is congruent to itself. So we would say side AB is congruent to side AB by the reflexive property. So every time you guys see a triangle sharing a side, you need to go and talk about the reflexive property somewhere in your proof. Anytime that you guys see vertical angles in your proofs, you are going to go and have to talk about the angles in the proofs. Now, we've discussed vertical angles several times this year already. The first thing you guys have to do is state that they are in fact vertical angles. Also, if those numbers are not there, go ahead and put them in your picture yourself, but we're going to go ahead and name those angles 1 and 2. So when I say angle 1 and angle 2 are vertical angles, is that the definition of vertical angles or is that the vertical angle theorem? The definition. So then you would state definition of vertical angles. And then you are going to go and tell me what they do, which they have to be congruent to each other. So angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, and that's that vertical angle theorem. So anytime there's vertical angles, it's going to take 2 steps out of your proof for you. You have to tell me that they're vertical angles first, and then tell me they're congruent. Rule number 3. Anytime you guys see midpoint in the given, it says you are given that B is the midpoint of AC. You need to go and talk about the 2 congruent sides that are formed. So the first thing will happen is this will be in the given part. So you will say B is the midpoint of AC and write given after it. And after that's given to you, since B is the midpoint of AC, you need to go talk about the 2 congruent sides that are formed. The order matters, so make sure you're going in the right direction. If I start at angle A and say AB, side AB is congruent to, should it be BC or should it be CB? CB, because A would be congruent to C and B would be congruent to each other as well. And then because I've got that word midpoint up there, we use definition of midpoint to determine that those 2 sides would have to be congruent to each other. Rule number 4 is another big vocab word. We see the word bisector. So you are given that B is the bisector of AC. So we're bisecting a segment. So again, you would have that as your given. And if point B is the bisector of AC, point B is splitting AC in half. So you would go and say that AB is congruent to CB again. But this time it's not definition of midpoint because that's not the vocab word they used. What vocab word did they use? Bisector. So it'd be definition of bisector. Okay, and then 3 more rules that commonly appear are on the back of that cheat sheet. We're using that bisector vocab word again, except for this time you're bisecting an angle instead of a segment. So once again, it says you are given that PN bisects angle MNO. That was given to us. Now, if PN, which is this segment here, bisects angle MNO, What two things have to be congruent? Go ahead, Jonathan. Angle MNP and angle ONP. If those numbers are up there, do I have to name them with 3 letters? No, let's just call them what? Angle what and angle what? 2 and 3. So angle 2 and angle 3 would have to be congruent. And that is because of definition of angle bisector. Questions up to that point? Okay, these last couple. Perpendicular is a big one. Make sure you star it and look at it before you take your test. It takes a lot of steps every time you guys know something is perpendicular. So the first thing is the fact that RO is perpendicular to MP, and that is given to us. Okay, once you guys know 2 lines or 2 segments are perpendicular, what do you guys know about them? What does perpendicular do, Gabby? They form right angles. So the next thing you have to go and do is tell me what angles up here are right angles. Well, if RO is perpendicular to MP, it would be angle 3 and angle 4 that are right angles. So angle 3 and angle 4 are right angles. And that is, how did we know that? Definition of perpendicular. Okay, but your whole goal is to tell me about things that are congruent. Well, now that we know angle 2 and angle 4, I'm sorry, angle 3 and angle 4 are right angles, what do we know about angle 3 and angle 4? They're congruent, they're equal to each other. So angle 3 is congruent to angle 4, and that is going to be because all right angles are congruent. Please put a big star by this. We use this a lot in these proofs. And it's a lot of steps every time it's perpendicular. Every time you see perpendicular lines, you're going to have to write this down. So that's why that green sheet or that cheat sheet in front of you will be perfect for you as you're working through your proofs today. Okay, last rule is going to deal with parallel lines. Anytime you are given that there's parallel lines, you are going to either go and talk about alternating interior angles or corresponding angles. We will not talk about alternating exterior angles. We will not talk about consecutive interior because consecutive interior are supplementary. We're trying to prove parts congruent. So we will always go and talk about either corresponding or alternating interior angles. So notice here it says AD is parallel to BC, and that was given to us. You have to be extremely careful here. So here's AD, that's parallel to BC. And then you've got a transversal that connects those 2 parallel lines here. And this is the trickiest part for whatever reason. Deciding if we're talking about 1 and 2 or 3 and 4. They have to touch the parallel line and the transversal. So if they have to touch the parallel line and the transversal, is it going to be 1 and 2 that we talk about in this picture, or 3 and 4? 3 and 4 touches the parallel line and the transversal, touches the parallel line and the transversal. So you would then say angle 3 is congruent to angle 4. Where does the parallel go? Did we know they were parallel first, or did we know they were congruent first? Parallel. So we'd say if parallel, my alternating interior angles are congruent. Or it might be corresponding angles that we talk about. So same thing down here. AD is parallel to BC. That was given to us. So here's AD. Here's BC. The transversal is going to be the line that goes through 2 of those. So we're going to use this one here as our transversal. We're going to use D to E as the transversal. What 2 angles are congruent and they have to touch the parallel lines and the transversal? Is it A and B? Do those touch the transversal? A and B, do they touch transversal? No. Do 1 and 2 touch the transversal? Do they also touch the parallel lines? Yes, so it'd be angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. And what kind of angles are those? Corresponding. So once again, we knew the lines were parallel first. So if parallel, my corresponding angles are congruent. Corresponding, if you write consecutive down, I will count it wrong. Those are called corresponding. Okay, so keep that green sheet in front of you as we work through our proofs today, because I'm going to keep referring to it and say, go look at this rule. So now we are ready to prove our triangles congruent. What is the shortest way to prove triangles congruent? How many pieces of information have to be congruent before you can tell me those two triangles are congruent, Gabby? 3. So you have to have 3 congruent signs before we can use any of these 5 rules: side, 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 angle, side, angle, side, angle, 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 side, or hypotenuse, leg. Let's see what they gave us, and then we'll work from there. AC is congruent to EC. That was given to us. Mark them in your picture. I promise you it will help you in the long run. They also told us that BC is congruent to DC. That was also given to us. And once again, go mark that in your picture. I promise you it's super helpful in the long run. Okay, so I have a congruent sign here. In my first congruent statement that I used, did I talk about sides or did I talk about angles? Sides. So I'm just going to write a little S over here. You guys don't have to do this, but it's just visually to help you out. Second congruent sign. Did I talk about sides or did I talk about angles? Sides. And how many pieces of information did we just determine need to be congruent before I can prove the triangle's congruent? 3. How many congruent signs do I have right now? 2. So we need to find one more thing that's congruent, but we're out of givens. Agreed? So once we're out of givens, we got to go look at our picture. Looking at your picture, somebody tell me something else that's congruent using that picture. Caitlin. AD and BE, can we just say those third sides are congruent? Is there a third sides theorem? No. Is there a third angles theorem? Yes, we can't do the third side. Somebody tell me something else. Asher. Vertical angles, is he right? Okay, now we're lazy, right? If we're lazy, what did I say you have to do to your picture? You have to label it with numbers so I know what you're talking about. Before you start writing, go find that rule on that green sheet of paper that talks about vertical angles. It was rule number 2. How many things do you have to write down right now to talk about those vertical angles? 2 of them. You have to use definition of vertical angles and you have to use the vertical angle theorem. So the first thing we're going to do is state that those are vertical angles. So angle 1 and angle 2 are vertical angles. That's definition of vertical angles. Then you go tell me what they do every time. Every time we have vertical angles, you have to do this. Angle 1 is congruent to angle 2 by what, guys? Vertical angle theorem. It says it right there on that green sheet. That's why I made you write that green sheet down today. Okay, I'm going to go mark them in my picture. I now have another congruent sign. Did we talk about sides or did we talk about angles? Angles. This order right here does not matter. We did not have an SSA yesterday, agreed? But at least it helps us. So look at, could it be side, side, side? No. Could it be angle, side, angle? No, because I'd need 2 angles. Could it be side, angle, side? Yes. Could it be angle, angle, side? No. Could it be hypotenuse, leg? No, hypotenuse leg only works for what? Right triangles. So it would have to be side, angle, side if we did this right. Is that picture marked in the order side, then angle, then side? Yes. So we're now ready to prove our triangles congruent. Triangle ADC is congruent to triangle EBC. And that is going to be by side, angle, side. Done. Questions on our first proof? Okay, let's try another one then. Let's take care of the givens first. AD is congruent to CB. Oops, what am I doing? And then our second given up there is that AD is parallel to CB. Those little triangles there mean that those are parallel. How many congruent signs do I have right now? One. And are those sides or are those angles? Sides. Okay, so then I go to my next given. My next given is not a congruent sign, which means you need to use it to tell me something that's congruent. Which rule on your paper talks about parallel lines? Number 7, and it says if I tell you that you have parallel lines, you either need to talk about alternating interior angles or corresponding angles. Looking at this picture right now, which one is it going to be? Alternating interior. Now, be careful. If these are our parallel lines here, and this is the transversal, again, I'm lazy, so I'm going to number these 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 here. And 6, I missed one. Which 2 angles up there would be the congruent ones? Would it be 2 and 4? Would it be 3 and 6? They have to touch the parallel line and the transversal. 2 and 4. 3 does not touch the parallel line. Does everybody see that? It have to be 2 and 4. So we would say angle 2 is congruent to angle 4, because if my lines are parallel, then my alternating interior angles are congruent. So now I have another congruent sign. Did we talk about angles or sides? Angles. And I'm going to go mark 2 and 4 because, again, in the long run, that typically helps you out if you mark as you go. How many congruent signs do I need before I can go triangle to triangle? 3. How many do I have right now? 2. I'm out of givens. So I go look at my picture. Anytime you use your picture, there's 2 options, reflexive property or vertical angles. Do either one of those work right now? Which one? The reflexive property. This middle line is congruent to itself. Be careful on the order. If I name that middle line DB, we can always cheat right here. If I went D to B on the first triangle, what's the order on the second one? B to D. So make sure that you're following that order here. It flips the other way, and that's by the reflexive property. Now that I have 3 congruent signs, I'm ready to go triangle to triangle and use my proving statement. So triangle ABD is congruent to triangle CDB. And which one is it? Which reasoning? Side, angle, side again. Side, then angle, then side. Questions there? All right, let's keep moving. PQ bisects angle SPT. Let's write that down first. Don't write your other given yet. The reason I said don't write your other given, let's figure out what's congruent before we move on to the second given. You have rules numbers 4 and 5 that talk about bisects, but we're bisecting an angle, so we're actually looking at number 5 right now. If PQ bisects angle SPT, it's splitting angle P up here in half. So I'm going to call those angle 1 and angle 2. And we need to go talk about angle 1 being congruent to angle 2 by what? Good. Definition of angle bisector. And we've got our very first congruent sign, and we've talked about angles. Now I'm going to move on to the second given, which is that angle S is congruent to angle T. That's given to us. I'm also going to go mark that in my picture up here. And once I mark that in my picture, I've now got my second congruent sign, and we talked about angles again. We are out of givens. Where do I go once we are out of givens? We go look at the picture. What can I mark in the picture? Reflexive. They share that middle line again. So if I call it PQ, What order does it have to be in on the second one? PQ. Use this to help you out. And that's going to be our reflexive property. And now I have 3 congruent signs. Remember, this order is not necessarily true. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. This angle side right here, we're going to have to look. But I'm ready to prove triangle SPQ congruent to triangle TPQ. And let's go look at our picture. You've got an angle here, you've got a side over here, and you've got an angle here. So is it angle, side, or angle, side, angle? Angle, side. The side's not between those 2 congruent angles, so it should be angle, side. Any questions up to that point? All right. K is the midpoint of OM. I don't see a congruent sign in that statement. So your job is to go tell me what's congruent. So if K is the midpoint of O to M, what 2 things are congruent? MK and OK. So MK and KO, just make sure you're following those orders from that proving statement. So KM is congruent to OK, and that is by definition of what? Of midpoint. Okay, now we've got our first congruent sign, and we're going to move on to our second given here. So our second given says that KQ is parallel to OP. Again, that's not a congruent sign, but you have a rule that says that if I talk about parallel lines, that you either need to talk about alternating interior angles or you need to talk about corresponding angles. Which 2 are we talking about this time? Corresponding. So those corresponding angles have to touch the parallel line and the transversal. We're going to call those 1 and 2. So angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, because if my lines are parallel, then my corresponding angles have to be congruent. And that's congruent sign number 2. Oops, I could number correctly. And the last given that we have is that angle QMK is congruent to angle PKO. And since those 2 angles are congruent, I'm going to go mark them up here. And that's given to us. Another congruent sign, those are angles. I have 3 congruent signs, and we're ready to go triangle to triangle. So triangle QKM is congruent to triangle POK. Look at your picture. What is it? Side angle side? Angle side angle? ASA, we've got A, angle, side, angle, and we're done. Okay, we will get to that last proof on there tomorrow. Your homework tonight is going to be the very first proofs worksheet A. There's actually 2 proofs worksheet A's, but you only need to do 1 through 6 tonight. So 1 through 6 tonight. And then tomorrow we will do the second proofs worksheet A. We split it into 2 days. If you are having trouble, you've got to get in. I can't go through your whole worksheet before we start tomorrow. So come in and get help from me if you're having issues.